Today we look at fantasy swords that match ideas from the late medieval Talhoffer manuscripts.
This is the Kitsune clan, a group of sword enthusiasts who like cosplay, reenactment, and historical martial arts. If you have similar interests, feel welcomed.
We've talked about it already once. If you take the famous Talhoffer manuscripts, we will find depictions of strange swords. And either some fantasy swords got inspired by these ideas, or they came to the same ideas that Talhoffer had at the time. What are we talking about? Swords that have, besides the blade, additional spikes or smaller blades somewhere on the handle, usually either at the pommel or the crossguard is somehow transformed into spikes or blades. We've had such a case from a sword from the Witcher series. Today we want to talk about two cases from Sword Art Online, one from Honkai Star Rail and one from Demon Slayer. And all of these have in fact transformed crossguards, so the crossguards can be used for attacking. And in the case of the Honkai Star Rail sword, also the pommel has been transformed into another blade. The idea behind such special swords is of course that you have additional ways of attacking your opponent, and not only additional ones but unexpected ones. And we can see that attacking with the crossguard is of course an advantageous possibility if you get in infight, so if you get closer, but also if you turn the sword around and use it in Mordschlag, so if you grab the blade and strike with the crossguard as it would be a warhammer or a pickaxe. In such cases you can also hook and push and do whatever you would do with a pickaxe. For most of these swords you have then the problem of course that you are gripping the sharp side of the weapon, and we know already how do you do that. You first, ideally you would wear gloves, but the manuscripts don't indicate gloves or use of gloves at the time. The main trick seems to be not to grab the sharp side but the flat side. That has been tested with steel swords repetitively and it seems to work. You might get some smaller cuts, but on the same time you will probably effectively kill your opponent, so that's a small price to pay in the historical context. What's now interesting about these training swords, they are all made for cosplay, so they are made of foam, and that means we can rigorously strike with these things and experiment quite a bit with these, and otherwise they behave quite good as normal swords. They are of course a bit lighter and they have a certain flex to it, but on the other hand you can train without a lot of protective gear. The problematic part with these types of strikes, with the Mordschlag, even with a lot of protective gear, this gets dangerous really fast, not only in steel, also with the polypropylene training weapons, because there's simply a lot of force behind these strikes that are projected on a single small point. So even with a lot of protective gear, these things can strike through. And also with the foam weapons at hand, from time to time, if they hit on a point, it's still a lot of force on a single tiny point, and you can get some little marks from them, and it can also really hurt, even though this is foam. So what do these swords offer us? They offer us a training of ideas that Talhoffer and some other late medieval manuscripts have put forward. The question is of course whether these swords were real. I'm not aware of a specimen in the museum collection that would resemble any of these swords, so they could have been a rare thing, or they could have just been ideas that never made it into real existence. So they could be fantasy swords in the meaning of the word, and that would be a funny parallel, of course. Interestingly, if we look at the animes and mangas where these swords have been used, they don't seem to have been used like Talhoffer suggested it with Mordschlag or even with half sword. We rarely see stuff like that, and that's of course a shame, because that would have been an option to get something really, really cool. Concerning the the props we are using here, the two from Sword Art Online are rather interesting because they work well as normal swords and they also work well in Mordschlag. The one with the very, very short crossguard, of course, has the problem that it has not so much hand protection. On the other hand, we pointed out already that in the Sword Art Online swords, other video is linked in the description box, we can have the problem that the crossguards rip off, and that will not happen with this very, very short one. For the Demon Slayer sword, we have the additional advantage that the blade has a spared part where there's no sharp region, which is of course a disadvantage concerning cutting, but it also means for Mordschlag we can really strongly grip this area and strike with the four-pronged Tsuba that provides a nice hitting point and makes this also very effective, for example, in half sword. For the Honkai Star Rail sword, I have to say I'm not a big fan of the idea that the pommel is pointed and pointing at me. The grip is also very short due to that, so you cannot as properly grip it as the Sword Art Online swords. Also, there's another problem with the nature of this prop because it has holes in the blade. We had a video about swords with holes in the blade, and they have a construction problem because they don't have a glass fiber or other type of central rod. They are usually made with two wires that can go around the holes, but that means that these swords bend, and that's what we can also see with the Honkai Star Rail sword here. It bends heavily in all directions, and that makes it definitely less fun to play with. If you just want to get one of these swords for simple training, then probably the Sword Art Online swords are the ones that are most interesting. The Demon Slayer sword is interesting on its own. There have not been too many thoughts put into the idea that you can strike Mordschlag with Japanese swords, but you can, because the Tsuba offers also the same advantage as a crossguard, that you have a concentrated area where you can strike, and especially the Demon Slayer versions with these pointy type of Tsuba protrusions are really interesting in this aspect, and it offers a training or experimentation with these type of weapons. In general, we can of course ask, is any of this really improving the sword significantly if we compare a normal German longsword and we attack with a crossguard? We can already recognize, hey, that also is pretty devastating, and so I'm not entirely sure whether there is a lot of advantage in adding these pointy parts to the crossguards. When we look at the Witcher sword, where we had a mace-like pommel, that was definitely something that improved this aspect, but at a significant cost. It was tricky to use that sword in a more normal way, definitely. My advice here is go experiment yourself whether you think these swords have a major advantage over normal swords. It's definitely fun to play around with them, and it's a cool thing that the fantasy swords really offer here something for experimentation in the historical context, because usually if we look at fantasy swords, we often have to complain quite a bit in the sense of that they derive from historical context, but here this derivation refers to a source in the historical material and therefore gives somehow a support for how these ideas might have come up and give us a chance to experiment around with them. So with that, I have to say, I hope we could inspire you a bit, and see you around next time.